We are halfway through the 2020s, so it's time to take a look at the WCC's All-Decade Team.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Randy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Super fun show for you all today. I am thrilled to be joined by my friend Zack Farmer, the host of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, because we're talking WCC Hoops. Today we are doing our all-decade team for the WCC, as we are about halfway through the 2020s. And I think it was the College Basketball Report Instagram account posted all-decade teams for all the power conferences, and it was kind of fun to look through them. And I thought, this would be a fun activity to do for the WCC as well. And who better to come on than Zach to knock it out with me? So just a logistics in terms of how this is going to work. We're starting with the 2020-21 season and beyond. So players who kind of split their time, we're trying to only factor in the time that they spend in that specific window. So it's tough for somebody like Corey Kispert, for example, whose best season was his senior year, but only spent 1 year in that window. We're each going to pick our first team, second teams, and third teams. So in the first segment, we'll each pick our first team, second segment, second team, third segment, third team. Obviously, there will be some overlap, but it'll be fun to kind of take a look at how we kind of chose these teams. Obviously, comparing a one-and-done guy like a Chet or a Suggs versus a 4-year player, or guys like that, I think is kind of the fun challenge of trying to evaluate the incredible amount of talent that has come through the West Coast Conference in the last 5 or so seasons. And Zach, that's enough of an intro. I'm going to toss it over to you, and I would love to hear who you have on your first team, your 5 players and 1 coach. Hopefully you were ready for the coach, although that's a little bit easier. 5 players, 1 coach for your first team. Let's hear it.
All right. The first team, I mean, going through this, obviously we knew that there was going to be all these Zag heavy, Gale heavy, like all that sort of stuff. But this is the first team is definitely going to be an homage that, like, you have to honor the 2021 Zag team that got to the national title game, because you cannot look at the last 5 years and not remember, oh yeah, that was the first year of this entire decade. So with that said, first off is Drew Timme, probably arguably the best player that the WCC has had in the last 5 years. So that's number 1. Jalen Suggs is on my first team as well. Again, you talked about like the one and dones, but the one was pretty good. Jalen Suggs is there. The third Zag, I have Corey Kispert. Despite the 1 year only in this decade, just the impact that he had, the leadership and the role that he had on that Zags team to help them get to that title game. Obviously an undefeated team until they got to the title game. So a lot to be said about there. Now the 2 that are non-Zags, first Jalen Williams, I think, just even though like his prowess, like he bursts onto the scene, it was just the 1 year, his final year at Santa Clara, but he turned into someone who was maybe arguably the most dangerous player in the entire league. Like every team had the perk up when you played Santa Clara that year. If it hadn't been for a couple of illnesses that season, that Santa Clara team could have been looking at an NCAA tournament berth. So Jalen Williams is that other one. And then the 5th one I have is my pick for the best St. Mary's player of the entire run, and that's Logan Johnson, because he, like, you talk about just on the defensive end, just how much he was the tone setter for those St. Mary's teams in the early part of the decade. This was someone who also, when they needed him most, played at his best. Logan Johnson in the NCAA tournament was fantastic. In the WCC tournament is fantastic. Whenever you needed him to step up, Logan Johnson stepped up. So that wraps up my first team. And then as far as the coach, I mean, this one was hard because, again, we talk about championships, like, actually it's equal between the 2 top candidates, but I still almost have to lean Mark Few because of the title game. Like that mark alone, I think, is the separator. Even though, like, give it another year, like Randy Bennett, this could entirely flip, because if St. Mary's wins another WCC title this year, it's 3-2 at that stage, and I think you have to lean the other direction.
I love your picks. I was so happy. I was hoping that you would have somebody on your first team that I didn't even have on any of my teams, because I just think that shows the concentration of talent in this conference. And I thought really hard about Logan Johnson. I think he's an incredibly justifiable pick for this first team, but he didn't end up cracking on mine here. But we did have some overlap, understandably. I think 1A is Drew Timme. That's the easiest pick that you could make in this conference. The last half decade, 3-time All-American, one of the most prolific players in Gonzaga basketball history, in West Coast Conference history, frankly, in college basketball history, at least in the last 15 plus years or so. So that was an easy one for me. We also both had Jalen Suggs on our first team. Again, only 1 year, but he was the catalyst for a team making it all the way to the national championship, quite literally, in the sense that he hit the shot that sent them to the national championship game. Very difficult to ignore him. And then I had a third Zag, although not somebody on that 2020-21 team. I had Chet Holmgren starting at the 4, again, positionally. Drew and Chet started together, so I feel like you can justify starting them together on this lineup here. Again, another one and done guy, but Chet was so unbelievably impactful, and statistically, his performance doesn't hold up to some other guys, because he kind of took a back seat to Drew offensively, but he was so dynamic defensively, so dynamic in terms of contributing to winning basketball, that it was hard for me to not include him here. So I got Drew, Chet, and Jalen, and then I have 2 other players here that were not on your first team, although I imagine we'll be talking about them on your team soon. First off, I do have a wing from Santa Clara. It's just not Jalen Williams on the first team. It's Brandon Pajemski. I really wrestled with this here, because trying to compare college careers versus pro careers, obviously Jalen Williams has been the better NBA player, but Pajemski was so incredibly good when he won WCC Player of the Year, averaged nearly 20 per game. I mean, he was just a phenomenal rebounder, really was the catalyst for that Santa Clara team. So I ended up sneaking Pajemski here on the team, my first team. And then my last pick for player here is the 2-time WCC Player of the Year. Felt like that would be hard to ignore on the first team, and that's Augustas Marciulionis. So playing kind of off the ball with Jalen Suggs in this lineup. And I think there's a very justifiable argument that Logan Johnson is the best St. Mary's guard of the last half decade. I think Marciulionis is in that conversation. You could make an argument for Mahaney. If he had stayed longer, I think it'd be a stronger argument, but he did not. Regardless, Marciulionis, back-to-back WCC Player of the Year awards, whether you think he deserved them or not. I know many of you listening probably do not think that he deserved to win both of those awards, but he did, and was, again, the best player on 2 St. Mary's teams that won the WCC regular season. That does not happen very often, so that's why he gets the nod for me. And similarly, Zach, I struggled to determine which coach to go with here, because Randy Bennett and Mark Few have been pretty even, pretty comparable. But yeah, the tournament run for Mark Few, I mean, the tournament run all the way to the national championship game specifically, is what kind of pushes him over the edge for the first team head coach in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, these picks are hard. Like this, there's going to be guys left off. I expect the comment sections to not be happy with either one of us.
Good.
We're all said and done with this.
Let's talk about those second teams, Zach, because like we said, very, very, very difficult to pick just 5 names for the first team. We're going to talk about the guys who missed the cut for the first team but ended up on our second team. All that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, Prize Picks is the daily fantasy platform that lets you turn your football predictions into real rewards. Preseason is already heating up, and college football, it's not far behind. Whether you've got your eye on big-name quarterbacks or breakout running backs, Prize Picks makes it easy to get in the game. And Prize Picks is so simple to play. You just pick more or less on 2 to 6 players' stat projections. If you get your picks right, you could cash in and win up to 2,000 times your money. I've been using Prize Picks for a few years now, and I just love how simple it is. I can get a lineup in before my coffee even finishes brewing. Prize Picks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. With college football coming up, Prize Picks has Texas quarterback Arch Manning at 1.5 passing touchdowns for next Saturday's huge battle against Ohio State. I'm hitting over on that. If you want to join me, download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Today's episode is also brought to you by Drip Drop. If you're trying to stay on top of your routine, whether that's working out, spending long days on campus, staying focused through back-to-back classes, hydration is where it all starts. And that's where Drip Drop comes in. Drip Drop is doctor-developed and scientifically proven for fast hydration. It uses the perfect balance of sodium electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb fluids quickly, delivering 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of a leading sports drink. My go-to flavor is black cherry. It is a game changer after a workout or just on those extra busy days. I always keep a few packets in my backpack when I'm out and about. It saves me more than once from that midday crash. Right now, Drip Drop is offering Locked On listeners 20% off your first order. Just head to dripdrop.com, use promo code LOCKEDONCollege. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONCollege for 20% off. Stock up now before the heat hits hard. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still joined by Zack Farmer of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast, and we are still going through our WCC All-Decade team here as we are about halfway through the 2020s. We each listed our first teams there in the first segment. Now we're going to get into our second teams, and Zack, I'm going to start with you. Who was the guys that just did not quite make that first team roster, but that you're honoring here on the second team?
Now you brought him up in the first team, so of course I have Augustas Marciulionis as my first one off the board for my second team. You mentioned a 2-time WCC Player of the Year, the leader of the last 2 years where this team has gotten to the NCAA tournament, single-digit seed in each of those years. Hard to ignore that. The other St. Mary's player coming off the board for me is going to be his running mate, Mitchell Saxon, the 2-time Defensive Player of the Year. Like, you think about just how good he was defensively, just one of the best rebounders, one of the best face defenders, and he could play inside and out. And I think that's one of the things that was a lot of times, I know he sometimes moved a little clunky or whatever else, but he was so effective in the way he was able to anchor that back line for St. Mary's. And again, a team that was one of the nation's leaders in rebounding, offensive rebounding, still one of the best defensive teams in the country. And Saxon was a big reason for that. The next couple are going to be Zags. Got Andrew Nembhard is going to be on this list. Obviously, we know he was part of that 2021 Zag team that reached the NCAA the final, the championship game. But after that, he remained one of the best point guards in the WCC. Arguably was obviously one of the best players in the league. Just his court vision, the way he was able to run that offense after that tournament, the championship run, and continue that legacy going was obviously incredibly impressive for Nembhard. Graham Ike is on my list here as well. And we know how effective Graham has been in his first few years as a Zag, and his points per game has just gone up and up and up in each year. And we've seen him just when he is motivated, when he can kind of keep the emotions in check a little bit. He is one of the best in the country, one of the best centers, power forwards, however you want to use him in these rotations. Obviously, he's kind of played a little bit of both, but Graham Ike is on that team for me. And then I am going a little bit in the Wayback Machine for a team that is no longer in the league. I have to go back to BYU and Alex Barcelo, because Barcelo was an absolute monster for the Cougars. You think about just not only as a scorer, but also as a distributor and a playmaker for those BYU teams. Yes, those BYU teams toward the end did not do particularly well as a whole, but Barcelo was a dude. That's the one thing. Think about Barcelo. I mean, he was 15 points per game, then 17 points per game those 2 years he spent with BYU in the WCC. And so Barcelo wraps up my second team going into this first half of the decade.
I love the shout for Alex Barcelo. Averaged 16 points per game in each of the 2 seasons in this decade that he was in the WCC with BYU. Was a 45+% 3-point shooter. Just an excellent player. Was not on my second team, but we had a ton of overlap outside of that. We both also had Mitchell Saxon. I think it's hard to ignore Saxon's 2 WCC Defensive Player of the Years. And like you said, I'm glad you brought this up. St. Mary's was one of the best offensive rebounding teams in the entire country during Saxon's tenure in the front court. And he didn't get enough national attention for how impactful he was, in part because it wasn't just him gobbling up offensive rebounds, which shows up on the stat sheet and gets you a lot of attention. It was a lot of those tip backs, which were just the most insanely frustrating thing for, I know Gonzaga fans have probably had nightmares about playing great defense for 29 and a half seconds and then forcing a bad shot. And then Saxon slaps the ball out to a guard and you got to do it all over again. It's deflating, it's frustrating, and it made him a very valuable player in a way that truly didn't show up on the stat sheet. And I think is part of the reason that he makes this team and gets this attention, whereas people who maybe are just reading the stats maybe wouldn't necessarily include him here, but he absolutely deserves it. I also had Andrew Nembhard on my second team for all of the reasons that you listed. He was a prolific playmaker. He could play on or off the ball. He's done both of those things effectively at Gonzaga and in the NBA with the Pacers. He was a menace in transition, getting out, running. He basically single-handedly wore down Memphis in the second round of the NCAA tournament in his senior year just by constantly getting out in transition and putting pressure on the opposing teams. He was a phenomenal player. My 2 other guys are guys that you had on your first team. Corey Kispert at the 4. Again, I was kind of struggling to figure out where to put Kispert because only one of his seasons technically is in this decade. So it's hard to only give him credit for 1 year when we know how great he was for 4 seasons at Gonzaga. But even that 1 year, I mean, he was an All-American. I think anybody who makes an All-American team in this decade out of the WCC, you got to find a spot for him somewhere. Kispert, I think, was a small ball 4 who could play the 3, phenomenal 3-point shooter. But more than that, he was tough on both ends of the floor, a good rebounder, could get to the cup if he needed to. There wasn't a whole lot he couldn't do for that Gonzaga team. And then similarly, Jalen Williams, another guy that I struggle between him and Pajemski, trying to evaluate just their college careers, not their NBA careers. But both those guys were incredibly productive in their time at Santa Clara. Jalen Williams, prolific scorer, 18 points per game, good shooter, just commanded attention from opposing defenses in a way that not a lot of players have done in this conference, specifically not a lot of players that didn't go to Gonzaga or St. Mary's. So those are the 4 of the 5 are guys that you've talked about already. The 5th is a guy that we haven't talked about yet. That's Jamari Bouye. Jamari Bouye from San Francisco. Again, his career is kind of right in the middle of that split for this decade, but he was so incredibly good for the Dons, a phenomenal scorer, a good defensive player, got a lot of steals, a good shooter, but really just a guy who thrives with the basketball in his hands, did so many good things. And I think we've talked about, I've talked about this on the Locked On College Basketball show a lot when we were talking about Florida, of like Todd Golden, anytime he gets a guard, you should feel good about that guard's development because he has proven time and time again his ability to successfully develop guards. And Jamari Bouye is almost always the example that I go to. Him and Khalil Shabazz, guys who were unheralded coming out of high school. Shabazz started at a junior college, and those guys developed into superstars. And Bouye he's been in the NBA for the last few years. He's a truly, truly talented player, and I think deserves a spot here as well. And then you didn't mention coach. I think it's pretty obvious that if Mark Few is the first team coach, Randy Bennett is the second team coach. And again, I think there was an argument, even with Mark Few making a championship run this decade, I think there was an argument for Bennett. And certainly it's not even debatable that he's number 2 on this list, if not number 1.
Yeah, for sure. Like that one slipped, the coach slipped my mind, but of course, yeah, it's Randy on that list. And yeah, the mention of Bouye, it's again one of those guys that you feared if you were the opponent and the game was on the line if he had the ball in his hands, because he lived for the moment. He knew how to rise to the occasion. And yeah, Jamari Bouye, a big part of obviously why that USF team reached the NCAA tournament back in 22.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to say not a lot of teams in this decade have made the NCAA tournament, and that San Francisco team is one of them. And Bouye was the catalyst for that happening. So that's part of the reason he gets the nod here. But Zach, we got 2 more teams coming up. We each got our third teams, and I think off the top of my head about 25 players who feel like they deserve to be on those spots, players that neither of us have even mentioned at this point yet. So excited to get into that. We're going to reveal those teams and talk about some honorable mentions to close out the show coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, if you're running a business, every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you needed a service. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You probably moved on. And that's why you need Open Phone, so you never miss an opportunity to connect with your customers. Open Phone is the #1 business phone system designed to streamline and scale your customer communications. You juggle 2 phones just to keep your business and personal calls separate? Open Phone solves that instantly. Your whole team can share one number and respond to customers like a shared inbox. No more who's handling this. And the AI agent handles after-hour calls, answers common questions, and captures leads so you never miss a customer again. See why over 60,000 businesses trust Open Phone. They're offering Locked On listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/lockedoncollege. That's openphone.com/lockedoncollege. They'll even pour over your existing numbers for free. Open Phone, no missed calls, no missed customers. All right, folks, closing out the show, continuing our fun conversation, looking at the WCC All-Decade Team for the last 5 or so years, last 4 seasons, I suppose, here with Zack Farmer of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. We've each given our first team and second team picks, 5 players, 1 coach for those teams. And now we're going to take a look at our third team. Zack, who do you got? I imagine there's some overlap with some guys we've already talked about, but excited to see who you got on your final team here.
Yeah, my third team, the first 3 guys on here are guys we've already talked about. So leading off, Chet Holmgren is on my third team. I think here it was the challenge of, we know the impact that Chet had, but he was only at Gonzaga for 1 year. The 1 year was not, like, obviously that was still a team that reached the Sweet 16. That was still a really, really good Zag team, but not quite to the level of something else. Also because the role he had was smaller for the Zags while he was there. So obviously we always think about what these players become afterwards, and obviously Chet has turned into a really good NBA player, but his role at Gonzaga was a little smaller, and so that's why he kind of slipped a little bit down to that third team for me. Brandon Pajemski is here as well on my third team. Similarly, at least on the tenure, only 1 year at Santa Clara. And I do think about just the impact that he had. And yes, this was a Santa Clara team that also had aspirations for the NCAA tournament, although I feel like this team was a little further away than the Jalen Williams team. So I think that was there was a little bit of that. And also, like, I felt like that there was a separation between like Jalen Williams and Brandon Pajemski in the big moments later on that in their final seasons, where Jalen seemed to rise and Pajemski didn't rise as much as we saw from Jalen Williams. Jamari Bouye, we already talked about him and how great he is. Like, he lives for the moment. He lifted that USF team to an NCAA tournament and was a killer in the NCAA tournament. He was the one who forced that game into overtime against Murray State with a shorthanded Don's team. So Bouye sits here as well. Now, because I had Bouye, I could not, in good conscience, go without his running mate. Khalil Shabazz is also on this team for me. The two of them together were arguably the best backcourt in the WCC at the time. The collective of the two of them, you never could take an off night when these two were coming in, because if it wasn't Bouye, it was Shabazz. Like, if these two, it was a 1-2 punch that if one of them was going to get you on a given night. And I think even back to Khalil's last night, or the last WCC tournament, where I think they were trailing Santa Clara about like 15 or something like that late in that game, and he single-handedly just like pulled USF to overtime, got them to win in overtime. I think he had something ridiculous. It was like 20 points in the last like 5 minutes of that game, because he just would not go home. Just thinking about those sorts of moments with Khalil and just how good he was for that USF squad. And then my last one, I am always a I'm always a sucker for good defense, great team basketball, and that's why Anton Watson is my last pick on for my third team, because he did all the dirty work. He did all the little things, and was one of the best defensive players in the WCC over the last 5 years. When you needed him to be the offensive guy, he could, but he took so much pride in doing everything else for those Zags teams. And so I've got to put in Anton Watson to wrap up that third team. And for the coach, I think can't not say it's Todd Golden, because he got to the NCAA tournament with that USF squad. Yes, like we talked about, the years he was actually here was only 2 years. So there's a little bit of the time crunch, but he did something that no other WCC coach outside of you and Bennett have been able to do.
I was really curious when you were naming your last player. I was like, all right, who's going to be the best guy that neither of us have on our teams? And once you said Watson, I picked a few guys that I think it probably is. I'll give my third team first, but my goodness, we left some really good players off of these teams. I do also have Anton Watson. In fact, I went kind of Zag heavy on my third team here. A few guys we've already talked about. Anton Watson, for a lot of the reasons you listed, phenomenal defensive player. When the Zags needed him to take on a bigger role offensively, his final season he did. I mean, single-handedly led Gonzaga to a win over UCLA in the Maui Invitational. I think he had 36 of the team's 62 points in that game or something like that. Like, he was an incredibly gifted and talented player, hometown kid from Spokane. Really hard to keep him off this list. I also went with Graham Ike, who you had on your second team. Same types of stuff. A phenomenal scorer, has proven he can play both the 5 and the 4, stepped it out a little bit more and shot some threes last year, sometimes to great success, like the game-tying 3 against Oregon State. Sometimes he tried to do a little too much, like the 3-point attempt against St. Mary's in Moraga that did not go so well. But overall, Graham has been such a gifted player for Gonzaga, and with one more year, I think he'll cement his spot as one of the best players in this conference over the last half decade. And then a couple other Zags here. It's hard for me to ignore Julian Strother. He was one of the last players I picked because I was deciding between him and 3 or 4 other guys, including Logan Johnson, who you mentioned, including Khalil Shabazz, who you mentioned as well, and then a few guys who shockingly did not make either of our teams. But Strother was such a talented scorer. He was so clutch. He hit that huge 3, not only against UCLA in the NCAA tournament, but he also hit a clutch 3 to beat BYU in the regular season that year as well. A prolific scorer who didn't get as much attention for his defense, but he worked very hard on that end of the floor as well. And then couldn't ignore the WCC single season assist record holder, as well as the 5th most assists in a single season in the history of recorded college basketball history. And that's Ryan Nembhard, who was so incredibly good last year. There are so many great guards in this conference. The fact that it is actually justifiable to not have Ryan Nembhard on these 3 teams feels insane to me, but it is, because the guard play is so good. But Ryan may not have been a great scorer. He may have struggled defensively, mostly because of his size, but his floor vision and passing is better than anybody I've ever seen at the collegiate level. And I'm excited to see what he does next year with Dallas in the NBA. So those are my Zags on this list. I also have one other player on the list here. And again, tons of guards to choose from. I thought about Shabazz. I thought about Barcelo. I thought about Logan Johnson. I ended up going with a guy because there's just not a lot of dudes in the WCC who score 20 points a night. It just does not happen very often. And that's what Malik Thomas did last year for San Francisco. So to me, it felt like he had to make a spot. He had to find a spot on this list. Thomas, again, was a transfer from USC, spent a couple years with the Dons. He's actually at Virginia this upcoming season, so we'll see how he does in the ACC. But Thomas was one of the best scorers that has been in this conference in a very long time, and a guy that I know Gonzaga worked very hard to game plan against. And I'm sure you saw St. Mary's have to work pretty hard to game plan against him as well. And for coach, Zach, I was really torn. I was torn between the 2 San Francisco coaches, Todd Golden and Chris Gerlofson. I was also torn between including Herb Sendek, who's won 55 to 60% of his games every year that he's been at Santa Clara in this last decade. But ultimately, the reasoning was the same reasoning that you gave, which is there's only one other coach who's brought his team into the NCAA tournament, and that's Todd Golden. So for me, again, trying to remove the bias of he's also a national champion head coach, having done it at Florida this last year, from the equation, I think Golden is the guy you got to go with here, with respect to both Sendek and Gurlifson, who I think are very much in this conversation. So those are our teams. And Zach, the player that first jumped out to me that didn't make either of our rosters was Adama Alpha-Ball, who spent the last couple of years at Santa Clara, dipped a little bit his second year. I think if his second year at Santa Clara had been as good as his first year, maybe he gets a little bit more attention here, but certainly a player that deserves some accolade, deserves some love for how good his career was. I got a few other names, but is there anybody that you really struggled with? Maybe guys that we haven't talked about yet. I'm sure you thought about Ryan Nembhard. I'm sure you thought about Malik Thomas, but are there other guys that maybe haven't gotten mentioned yet?
I mean, Jonathan Mobo is one that just jumps out at me that none of we didn't mention at all. And because he was, again, 1 year at USF, but he exceeded all of our expectations of what we thought he would end up being. One of the best defensive players in the league. He was able to do, and his offensive game just got better and better and better as the year went on. He was supposed to just kind of come in and be their defensive guy, like be that rebounder, be that rim protector, and he ended up being so much more for USF in the 1 year he was there. Another name for a team we have not even discussed at all that I wanted to bring up, Colby Ross. He only 1 year of this 5-year run was he still at Pepperdine, but Colby Ross was someone who could absolutely take over a game. And I think back to, it wasn't in this 5-year window, but I believe it was either 2019 or 2020, Pepperdine and St. Mary's, where he and Jordan Ford just went basket for basket, where I think both of them ended up with like 40 plus points. And it was just an absolute show watching Colby Ross run those Pepperdine teams of the late teens and early 2020s.
Great picks. I think Mobo and Alpha Ball were the top two names on my list, so I'm glad you talked about him first. Colby Ross is a great shout. I would also shout from a couple other Pepperdine guys that come to mind. I think Kessler Edwards was only in this decade for 1 year as well, but I think he averaged 17 or so per game that season. Maxwell Lewis, an NBA draft pick, player who's been in the NBA that we didn't talk about. That's for a conference like the WCC, for two guys who watch this conference to pick 15 players and have a guy who made the NBA not be on those teams is a testament to the depth of talent in this league. Lewis was phenomenal his sophomore year at Pepperdine, 17 a game, just a tremendous score. Didn't really impact winning, which is part of the reason that he's not on the list. Same with a guy like Houston Millett, who was also phenomenal for a couple of years and has been at Alabama, the last couple of years. A few others that I'll rattle off quickly here. Marcus Williams, another great guard at San Francisco. Carlos Stewart. Tyler Robertson was like a walking triple-double waiting to happen at the University of Portland. Again, that Portland's team was never really very good, but he was phenomenal. Pretty clearly the best player they've had in the last 5 years or so. Mo Odom, great at two different WCC schools and now at Arizona State. Javon Porter, Ben Gregg and Alex Dukas are two guys who are just phenomenal role players for their programs, and I think deserve some love, but I think kind of understandably didn't quite crack the list here. And then I had another BYU guy that I wanted to mention, Fusini Traore, who was phenomenal. He spent part of his career with BYU when they were in the Big 12, but the time that he was with them in the WCC, he was excellent for them as well. So that's a long list. There's even more guys I'm sure that we didn't get to.
Cam Shelton, Joseph Vrankic, like you think about some of these other guys that there were just some absolute studs in this league that just it's hard to break this list. And this is a list 5 years in. We do this in 5 years when it's the actual full decade. There are going to be a lot of these names that are left off, and it's going to hurt.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, and there's like full teams we haven't even talked about. With apologies to San Diego, I don't think we mentioned a single player from San Diego. It was probably Joey Calcaterra.
Had been there like 2 years later. Probably been mentioning him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think if we had more time on this show, I'd be interested to hear some of those guys that might make the team in a year or two, like maybe a Braden Huff or a Tyrone Riley, guys like that. But it's already a phenomenal list for a very, very fun conference. And Zach, like I said, before we hit the record button, we could probably do this for 90 minutes. We're not going to do it for 90 minutes. Maybe some other time we'll take a look at some other conversations around this, but this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the show. I appreciate having you on. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for us today, though, here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back later this week with one more show for you all as we get into the off season here on Locked On Zags. Thanks again, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, I'll say it. I'm sorry, Zach, but go Zags.